Welcome to Thought Grid. Time is supposed to be steady. Seconds ticking forward, days flowing into weeks, years shaping our lives. But what if it isn't? What if reality slips for just a moment and you find yourself somewhere you shouldn't be? In another decade, another place, another time altogether. Tonight, you'll hear 3 true time-slip horror stories that can't be explained. Ordinary people who stepped out of their world for only moments, but returned with memories that defy logic. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't getting lost in space, it's getting lost in time. Story 1. The hotel that shouldn't have existed. It was the late 1970s when a couple named Roger and Linda set out on a long road trip across the French countryside. Their plan was simple: visit small towns, see historical landmarks, and enjoy a little adventure away from their routine lives. They weren't reckless travelers. Everything was organized, routes traced on maps, motels booked in advance, even backup plans in case of delays. But one evening, after hours of driving winding back roads, they realized they had miscalculated. The sun had slipped away quicker than expected. By the time Roger noticed the road sign marking their intended stop, they had already passed it. Both were tired, too drained to consider turning back. "We'll find something soon," Roger said, trying to reassure both of them. That was when they saw the sign. A weathered wooden board, its paint flaking, swinging gently from rusted chains. Carved into it, in faded letters, were the words, "Hotel de Lange." The sign pointed down a narrow gravel lane that seemed to lead nowhere. Curious and desperate for rest, they followed it. The building that appeared from the shadows looked like something out of another century. A 2-story structure with dark wood beams, pale stone walls, and shutters painted a dull, peeling green. Gas-style lamps glowed faintly by the entrance, their flames flickering against the glass. To Roger and Linda, it was strange but charming, like they'd stumbled into a piece of history. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and oil. The front desk was manned by a man in his 50s, hair slicked back, clothes oddly old-fashioned. A waistcoat, a stiff white shirt, and shoes polished to a dull shine. His French was polite but strangely formal, the kind of phrasing you'd expect to hear in an old film. He offered them a room without hesitation, writing their names in a thick ledger rather than entering them into a system. The pen he used was a fountain pen, its nib scratching across the page. The decor was just as unusual. Heavy wooden chairs lined the lobby. The wallpaper was patterned with faded flowers. Instead of electric lamps, iron lanterns hung from hooks in the walls, burning faintly. The guests Roger and Linda saw passing through the hall were equally strange. Families dressed in clothes that looked decades out of date. Women wore long skirts, men wore suspenders, and children carried toys carved from wood. At dinner, things grew stranger still. The food was hearty but simple. Bread, stew, cheese, and wine poured from an unlabeled jug. There were no menus, no receipts. When Roger asked about payment, the innkeeper smiled and said, "Tomorrow morning will be soon enough." The couple laughed about it later in their room, chalking it up to the place's old-fashioned style. But even in their laughter, Linda admitted something felt strange. There were no phones, no radios, no televisions, no modern conveniences at all. Even the windows had thick wooden shutters rather than glass panes. She remembered whispering, "It's like we stepped back in time." That night, they slept in a heavy bed with carved wooden posts. The silence was absolute. No passing cars, no hum of electricity, not even the sound of plumbing. Just quiet, so deep it pressed against their ears. And for both of them, that silence was unnerving. In the morning, sunlight poured through the shutters. The innkeeper greeted them warmly, served them breakfast of bread and milk, and gave them their final bill. The price was shockingly low, barely enough to cover the food, let alone the stay. Roger paid in cash and received a handwritten receipt, scrawled in ink on yellowing paper. They left in good spirits, waving to the staff and promising to recommend the hotel to friends. But a few days later, retracing their route to tell another couple about the charming old inn, they couldn't find it. They drove the same roads, took the same turn. The sign for Hotel de Lange was gone. In its place was nothing but a broken fence and fields stretching into the horizon. Confused, they stopped in a nearby town and asked about the inn. The locals looked at them blankly. Some laughed, others frowned. "No hotel has ever been out there," one man insisted. Another shrugged and said, "There used to be an old inn, but it burned down in the 1900s. The couple returned again and again, certain they'd eventually find it. But every time, the road ended in emptiness. Later, when they developed their photos, something unsettled them even more. Every picture from their trip printed perfectly, except one, the shot Linda swore she had taken of the hotel. Instead of a quaint old building, the photo showed only blurred trees and an empty road. No building, no sign, no lights. They still had the receipt, handwritten, the ink faded, the paper unusually brittle. Investigators later examined it and confirmed the style of paper hadn't been common for decades. Some suggested it was manufactured before the Second World War. To this day, Roger and Linda insist they stayed at the Hotel de Lange. They remember the taste of the stew, the creak of the bed, the warm smile of the innkeeper, but no one else has ever found it. Some say they slipped into the past for one night, unknowingly stepping across a seam in time. Others believe the hotel was never real at all, but a fragment of something caught between worlds. Whatever the truth, they checked into a place that should not have existed and left through a door that may never open for anyone again. Story 2. The Soldier Out of Time. The Second World War was filled with chaos, destruction, and moments so surreal that soldiers often wondered if reality itself was bending under the weight of violence. Among the stories that emerged from those dark years, there is one account that refuses to fade, a story of a soldier who claimed he stepped out of his own time for only a few minutes. But what he saw defied all possibility. His name was Thomas, a young British soldier stationed in France during the early 1940s. He wasn't known for flights of fancy or tall tales. By all records, he was an ordinary man, serious, practical, the kind who never embellished his letters home. But one evening, as his unit rested on the edge of a bombed-out village, Thomas experienced something that haunted him until the end of his life. The night was cold, the kind of damp chill that clung to the bones. The men had lit small fires in ruined barrels to keep warm. Most were drinking, some were singing low songs to drown out the fear, but Thomas couldn't sleep. He wandered away from the group, down a narrow cobblestone street lined with shattered houses and broken windows. The moon hung high, casting pale silver across the rubble. And then, suddenly, everything changed. The air grew warmer. The ruins were gone. Instead, the street was alive. Buildings stood tall, windows intact, glowing with bright lights. Neon signs flickered in colors Thomas had never seen. Sleek cars, unlike anything from his time, rumbled past, their headlights white and sharp, their frames shining chrome. The sound of music drifted out from a cafe, but it wasn't jazz or swing or anything he knew. It was faster, sharper, pulsing with an electric beat. He staggered backward, his rifle slipping from his shoulder. People passed him on the sidewalk, but none seemed to notice the uniformed soldier standing frozen in their midst. Men in slim suits, women in dresses that shimmered under the glow of street lamps, children tugging on their parents' hands. For a moment, Thomas thought he was dreaming, but the scents, the gasoline, the perfume, the smell of hot food wafting from a vendor's cart were too sharp, too real. Then, just as suddenly, the world snapped back. The neon lights vanished. The cars disappeared. The street was rubble again, the buildings hollow, the air damp and cold. Thomas fell to his knees, trembling. When he returned to his unit, he tried to explain what he had seen. The others laughed at him, calling it a hallucination, a stress dream brought on by exhaustion. But Thomas never forgot the details, the designs of the cars, the glowing signs with words he didn't yet know, the sound of that strange, futuristic music. Years later, long after the war had ended, Thomas visited France again as a civilian. Walking through a city that had since been rebuilt, he stopped cold on a familiar street. It was the same one. The same buildings, restored, the same sidewalk. Only now, the neon lights, the cars, the music he had seen decades earlier were there, exactly as he remembered. He described it perfectly to those with him, down to the shop names that hadn't existed in the 1940s. For Thomas, there was no denying what had happened. Somehow he had stepped out of 1943 and into the 1970s, if only for a moment. Skeptics argue he imagined it, that his mind conjured visions of the future as a way to cope with war. But others believe Thomas experienced what few ever do, a true time slip, a glitch in reality that allowed him to glimpse a world decades ahead of his own. Until his death, Thomas swore the memory was sharper than any dream he'd ever had. He never embellished, never changed the details, never backed down, and those who heard his story always walked away with the same thought. If time can bend even for a moment, who's to say it won't happen again? Story 3. The Child in Two Eras, extended version. When Claire was little, her grandmother's house felt like a different world. The town was quiet, the streets lined with old stone walls and hedges, and her grandmother's home stood at the edge of it all, large and weathered, like it had been watching the village for centuries. Inside, the floors creaked with every step, the windows rattled in the wind, and the hallways always seemed a little darker than they should have been. Most children might have found it spooky, but Claire adored it. She loved exploring the attic, where trunks overflowed with yellowing letters and strange knickknacks. She loved running her hand along the carved banister of the staircase, smooth and worn from generations of use. And she loved sitting by the big kitchen window while her grandmother baked, watching the rain trickle down the glass. But the house gave her something else too, something no adult ever believed. She first saw him one afternoon when she was 6. She had been playing alone in an upstairs bedroom when she noticed a boy sitting cross-legged by the window. He looked about her age, but everything about him seemed different. His clothes were odd, short trousers, a starched shirt with buttons too high at the collar, and shiny leather shoes. His hair was neatly parted, his expression calm, almost too calm for a child. In his hands, he clutched a small toy horse, carved from wood and painted a dull brown. It looked old, like something from a museum. Claire stared, startled. "Who are you?" she asked. The boy smiled softly and said, "My name is Henry." His voice was polite, clipped in a way she didn't recognize. She assumed he must be a neighbor's child, though she hadn't heard anyone come in. Still, he seemed friendly. They played hide-and-seek in the hallways, ran laughing through the garden, and shared secrets the way children do. That evening, when Claire told her grandmother about her new friend, the woman looked puzzled. "No children visited today, sweetheart." You must have been imagining things, but Claire knew she wasn't imagining. She could still feel the cool wood of the toy horse Henry had placed in her hands. She remembered the way his laughter had echoed up the staircase. Over the next months, Henry appeared again and again. Sometimes he'd be waiting in the attic, smiling shyly as though he knew she'd find him there. Other times he'd sit on the back steps, his toy horse balanced carefully on his knee. He never seemed to change clothes, and he never spoke about parents or where he lived. When Claire asked him once, he simply said, "I live here. I always have." At night, Claire sometimes woke to faint footsteps in the hallway, too light to be her grandmother's. Once, she swore she heard Henry's voice humming softly outside her door. When she told her parents about him, they dismissed it. "Imaginary friend," they said. "Lots of kids have them." But he didn't feel imaginary. One rainy Saturday, Claire remembers distinctly, Henry grew strangely serious. They had been playing with cards in the living room when he looked up suddenly and asked, "Do you like it here?" "Of course," Claire said. "I love visiting Grandma's." He nodded, looking down at the toy horse in his hand. Then he whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Don't forget me." She wanted to ask what he meant, but her grandmother walked in at that moment, and when Claire turned back, Henry was gone. Years passed. Claire grew older, and Henry stopped appearing. By the time she was a teenager, she told herself she had outgrown him, that maybe everyone was right, maybe it had been an overactive imagination. Then, one summer when she was 16, she helped her grandmother clean the attic. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight as they opened old trunks and boxes. Inside one, buried beneath stacks of letters, Claire found an album of sepia photographs. Her breath caught when she turned to one particular page. A boy stared back at her, standing stiffly in a photographer's studio. He wore short trousers, a high-collared shirt, and polished shoes. In his hands, he held a small wooden horse. Beneath the photograph, written in neat handwriting, was a name, Henry, 1902 to 1909. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. The room spun. It was him, the same boy she had played with as a child. But the dates beneath his name told the truth. Henry had died decades before she was born. She never told her grandmother what she had seen. She closed the album quietly, her hands trembling, and said nothing. But inside, her world had shifted. As the years went on, strange things continued. When she stayed at the house during holidays, she'd sometimes wake to the sound of faint laughter upstairs. Objects she left on her nightstand would move in the night. Books shifted. Jewelry boxes opened. Once, she found a small wooden horse lying at the foot of her bed. It was gone by morning. The older she became, the more she wondered if what she experienced was a haunting or something else entirely. Some nights, lying awake, she wondered if Henry wasn't a ghost at all, but if somehow she had slipped across time, just enough for their worlds to touch. Perhaps, for reasons she would never understand, she and Henry had occupied the same house at different points in time, their lives overlapping in moments neither could explain. Now an adult, Claire rarely speaks about Henry, but she admits, in quiet moments, that she still feels him near. Sometimes she'll catch herself glancing down a hallway, half expecting to see him sitting on the stairs, toy horse in his lap. Sometimes she dreams of him, older now, but with the same solemn eyes, standing at the edge of her vision, as if still waiting for her to remember. And when she visits her grandmother's house, now empty and silent after her passing, she swears the air still carries the faint echo of children's laughter. The boards creak under light footsteps that aren't hers, and once, as she locked the door behind her, she heard a whisper so soft it could have been the wind. "Don't forget me." Time is meant to move forward, second by second, day by day, year by year. It's supposed to be the one constant in our lives, the thing we can trust to remain unbroken, but the stories you've just heard suggest otherwise. A couple stumbling into a hotel that history says was never there. A soldier who glimpsed neon lights, futuristic cars, and music that didn't yet exist. A child who played with someone long dead. A boy whose name was only remembered in faded ink and photographs. Each of these moments stands outside of explanation, beyond logic, and far away from the comfort of reason. Some people will dismiss them as tricks of memory, hallucinations, or imagination, but those who lived them swear every detail was real. The smells, the sounds, the touch of objects that shouldn't have existed. If they're telling the truth, then time isn't as steady as we believe. It frays, it bends, and sometimes it allows us to step into places we were never meant to see. That's what makes these stories so disturbing. Because if time can slip open for them, ordinary people, in ordinary moments, then it could happen to anyone. To you, to me, to the next person walking down a quiet street at night. So the next time the world feels strange, when the air shifts or a place looks slightly wrong, pay attention. You might not just be imagining things. You might be standing at the edge of a doorway in time, one that doesn't always close behind you,